None of us are worthy to share the gospel. God's not done with me.
If you have the opportunity to go, and you need to go.
Bring it on, baby.
Years ago, I was on a mission trip to South Africa. I was a part of a basketball team that played in some tournaments there, and we used that as an opportunity to share the gospel. And I was on a team with some former professional players and some friends of mine who all were from the Knoxville, Tennessee area. And so when we were in South Africa one morning, we went to get breakfast at this little restaurant, and a friend of mine, just a good old country boy from Knoxville, Tennessee, said to the person who was taking our order, "Y'all have any biscuits and gravy?" And I'll never forget the person looking at my friend like he was from outer space. And so he said, like biscuits and gravy. Y'all got any biscuits and gravy? And he kept repeating it as if that was making the situation better. And he was getting the same response, like, what in the world are you talking about? Because for those of you who've been to Europe, or you've been to places like South Africa, which has a lot of European influence, a biscuit is not a biscuit. A biscuit is a cookie. And so what this person heard in their vocabulary is, do you have any cookies and gravy? And thus the weird reaction, because who puts gravy on their snickerdoodles? And if you've traveled overseas and you've tried to maybe use some words that mean something to you that don't mean the same thing to the person you're speaking to, you know how very frightening that can be. For example, like we're in football season here. When you go to Europe, football's not football. Football is soccer. And I think we've earned the right now to own the word football. Like, I know for all of human history, football has meant soccer, but this is America, okay? And football should be football. But football's not football as you travel overseas. Football is soccer. Handy, we like to say, that's really handy. Well, in Germany, handy does not mean like you're good with your hands. Handy is a cell phone. Handy. In Ireland, I've been to Ireland, it's a beautiful country. A wagon in Ireland is not a wagon. A wagon in Ireland is an unpleasant woman. So you can imagine, as an American who's traveling to Ireland, you see, that's a real nice wagon you got there. You could get yourself in a lot of trouble. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've been talking with someone and the words you're using are not the words they're using. It can be a rather harrowing situation because different words have different meanings in different contexts. And then there's a dynamic in play where words can take on new meanings or different meanings throughout the passing of time. That's why, by the way, for those of you who are English majors, you know this, written language always follows spoken language. Because in our speaking over time, words can take on different meanings in our speaking, and then in our writing, that typically follows. You know, over the course of time, words can take on different meanings. They can expand in meaning, they can constrict in meaning, they can take on entirely different meanings altogether. You know, language is just a product of culture. So that's what makes an exchange that Jesus has with a religious expert during his earthly ministry so very interesting, because Jesus takes a word that meant something to this man that he's speaking with, and that meant something to the culture in which Jesus lived, and he actually is going to radically expand the meaning of the word in such a way that it introduces a new dynamic of gospel engagement. There was a word that this religious expert used all of his life. It meant one thing. There was a word that his culture used all of its existence. Jesus is now going to expand it. It's going to mean something entirely different. Jesus is going to take a word and he is going to broaden the meaning of it in a way that for some it's encouraging, and frankly to some it's offensive. The word is neighbor. Now that may seem like a pretty, benign word, neighbor. Well, the way Jesus uses it and the way he expands its meaning is radical. And as we'll see today, is offensive to some. Because for us, and really for the culture in which Jesus lived, the word neighbor simply meant the person that lives next door to you, or the person who lived in close proximity to you. There's a general understanding of neighbor throughout human history, and certainly in our culture, that suggests, your neighbor is someone who, generally speaking, embraces the same cultural values as you. They generally speak the same language. They probably look similar. They probably value similar things. Neighbor is typically associated with someone that you like, someone that you care for, someone that you get along with, someone that you can relate to, right? But what Jesus does in his ministry is something that is incredibly radical. And he takes this word and the meaning associated with it, and he radically expands it to mean something that some people were very uncomfortable with. Here's how he does it, okay? At one point in his ministry, Jesus talked about the two greatest commandments. And he seams together the Shema, which was the Jewish statement about the most important thing in life, right? You will love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? Deuteronomy 6. And he joins it together with something that came out of Leviticus 19, actually, that talks about neighbor. And Jesus joins together, in essence, kind of two summary statements about the law. In other words, Jesus kind of says, if you boil the law down to two pillars, the entire law, everything in the law, all the little minutia and all the big ideas, all of it, Jesus says, you can just put it on two pillars. It would all rest on two pillars. And Jesus says, here's the most important thing. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then, do you remember what he said? You will love your who? Your neighbor as yourself. That was new. There's no Old Testament scripture that puts those things together. This is new. Jesus says, you want to know what the most important thing is? It's two sides of the same coin. You love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then secondly, you love your neighbor as yourself. Man, this is like radical. No one had ever joined together those two aspects of the law before. Jesus doesn't just join them together. He says, actually, the entire law is built on these two things. And so I want to go to Luke 10. I want to show you here Luke 10, because here's what happens. There's a man who comes to Jesus and he says, okay, Lord, he's trying to justify himself. He says, okay, you know what? I want to show you I'm doing both these things. I'm loving God with all of my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I'm loving my neighbor as myself. Now, isn't that kind of audacious? This is like a kid, like we all grew up with these kids in school, right? They always knew the answer to every question in class. Any of you know a kid like, did anybody marry someone like that? If so, would you just point them out today? Let's just, okay. All right, the smart ones in the room. Okay, one right here, I see, okay. You know who you are, smart people. And some of these people, they raise their hand. And there's a point at which, in our own pride, right? I'm not saying any of you are like this, but sometimes you're more interested in showing other people that you know the answer to the question than you are in actually answering the question. And that's this man talking to Jesus. There's a guy who's coming up to Jesus during his ministry, and he wants to prove to Jesus and to others that he is the real deal. He's more interested in showing people what he knows than in actually knowing God. And so he actually says to Jesus, right? He's like, hey, I want to prove, I love God and I love my neighbor. And he asked Jesus, right, trying to justify himself. He's like, Jesus, just tell me who my neighbor is. Just give me an example of one of my neighbors, and I'll show you how I'm loving them. And this man, of course, is thinking of neighbor as how we would think of neighbor. He's thinking of neighbor as how historically his society thought of neighbor. Someone that he likes, someone that thinks like him generally, that believes like him generally, someone that he would get along with generally. And he's thinking Jesus is going to talk about a man or a woman that lives in his context. And he can say, let me show you how I'm loving my community. And he can justify himself. But that, of course, Jesus is privy to this. And so Jesus doesn't go along with this man's little self-justification. Jesus says, you want to know who your neighbor is? Let me illustrate with a story. Isn't it awesome how Jesus used story? Let me show you Luke 10, beginning in verse 30. Okay, here's what Jesus said. You want to know who your neighbor is? Let me break it down. Here's what it looks like. You see, there was a Jewish man who was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Now, this is very, very important. If you know geography, actually you went north to go to Jericho, but geographically, like in terms of topography, I think that's the right word. Okay, you go down. Okay, you with me? So that was important when you walk everywhere you went, right? It's important if you're going uphill or downhill. There's a big difference between the two. So you're actually going north, but you're going downhill, so to speak. So Jesus tells this story. There's a man going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he's attacked by bandits. Now, Jesus is telling a story here, but this is a story tied to historical realities because the road to Jericho was a very dangerous road. There are a lot of rocky places where bandits or robbers would hide out, and they would often appear, and they would injure, kill, rob on this road. It was known as a dangerous road. So Jesus is telling a story, but he's leaning into some historical realities. Okay, so Jesus says this man's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's attacked by bandits. They strip him of his clothes, they beat him up, and they leave him for dead. So the man's severely injured. He's lying on the side of the road. Now watch this. Jesus says, by chance a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Okay, this is important. He sees the man, but he's going to act like he doesn't see him, and he walks on the other side of the road. We've all done it, right? You bunch of hypocrites. This is why I'm preaching to you today, okay? Come on, you've seen that ex-boyfriend or girlfriend in the mall, right? And you've walked on the other side, or you've seen that person that you don't like, or you've been on a walk in your community, and there's that person you see that you don't like, and you act like you don't see them, and you walk on the other side of the road. We've all done it. So the priest does it. Sees the man lying there, he's gonna walk on the other side of the road, and he's gonna act like he doesn't see him. Okay? All right. Let's keep going. So then, a temple assistant, Levite, walks over and looks at him lying there. But he also passes by on the other side. And then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. And so he stops, verse 34, and he goes over to him. And the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. He put the man on his own donkey and took him to the inn where he took care of him. And the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, saying, "Take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." In other words, at his own expense, he cares for this Jewish man who was his enemy. And then Jesus says this, "Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits?" And of course, this self-justifying Jewish man says, "Well, the one who showed him mercy." And Jesus says, "Yeah, you go and do the same." Now, this is a famous story that Jesus tells. I actually think it's one of the most misunderstood stories that Jesus tells. Because what Jesus does here is radical. This isn't just a feel-good story about, hey, you ought to just help somebody who's on the side of the road. Man, what Jesus does here is radically redefine how a gospel-centered people live their lives. Would you just let that sink in a second? Jesus radically redefines how a gospel-centered people live their lives. How they manage their money, how they spend their time, how they think about their influence. This is radical. The man says to Jesus, "Well, who is my neighbor?" "Jesus, would you just tell me that my neighbor is my Jewish brothers and sisters, and then I'll be able to demonstrate to you how I'm loving them?" You see, it's impossible to prove your love for God to someone else. That's a personal, internal kind of thing, right? And so the man, in justifying himself, had no tangible way to say, "Well, I love God." I mean, he could talk about going to church or tithing or something, but I mean, really, he's trying to justify himself by showing, let me prove to you how I'm caring for my community. And Jesus isn't going to play the game. The man asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus isn't going to go along with his little self-justifying routine. Jesus tells this story. Jesus tells a story with some historical realities and a deep spiritual truth about what it looks like to live for him in this new kingdom that he's establishing. And so Jesus talks about this Samaritan. Of course, it's set in the context of a Jewish man being injured, and then you have the priest and you have the Levite who see him and walk on the other side of the road. They don't stop to help him. You see, this is profound because the priest is like varsity and the Levite here is like JV. All right? Or it's like the priest is like the sheriff's deputy and the Levite is like the mall cop. Okay? This is like kind of like legit priest, like top of the food chain, and then like, okay, you have like his assistant or his up-and-comer. Both see a fellow Jewish man who, don't miss what Jesus is doing here, their neighbor. And they're not inclined to do anything to help. It would have required a sacrifice of time. It would have required a sacrifice of money. It would have required a sacrifice of energy. And that dude's laying there. They're probably thinking, you know what, this happens all the time on this road. That's why Jesus talked about the road even in this story. Somebody else will get him. Somebody else will help him. Or it's too late. No help is going to really help at all. And then you have this Samaritan who stops. Now, if you're new to the Bible, you're new to this context between Jews and Samaritans, you understand for many, many years, Jews and Samaritans like hated each other with an intensity that really we see in the Middle East today, that we're seeing right now, frankly. I mean, this is like people who were raised to hate other people from their earliest days on planet Earth. You're taught that the right thing to do before God is to hate these people. So this isn't like, you're a Florida fan and you don't like Florida State fans. right? This isn't like some type of hatred that we know in America. That's not real hatred. The type of hatred that existed between Jews and Samaritans was a hatred that ran so deep it's hard for the American mind to comprehend it. Okay, the Mishnah, which was a commentary on the Old Testament by Jewish rabbis, made this statement: "He that eats the bread of a Samaritan is like one who eats the flesh of swine." Jews avoided Samaria in such a way, like they went way out of their way in their travels, literally just to avoid going through where Samaritans lived. Like if you were to travel from here to Canada, right, like it'd be like going through the Panhandle, hitting East Texas and going around, like, because you just want to avoid people from Georgia, which I totally understand. But I'm just saying, like, no, I'm just kidding. So I just want you, it's hard for us to understand this hatred. It was real. It was like, again, you're taught from your youth that to hate these people is actually the godly thing. And so here you have a Jewish man trying to justify himself. Jesus, who's my neighbor? Tell me who my neighbor is. I already know who it is. It's my Jews. It's my friends. Right, it's my coworkers, and then I'm going to give you some examples of how I'm doing that. I'm going to justify myself, and Jesus doesn't even answer the question. He says, let me tell you this story, and the story is radical, and the story is offensive because the priest doesn't stop, and the Levite doesn't stop, but the Samaritan stops. And why does he stop? Because he had compassion. Now don't miss the obvious, okay? His compassion for the man who was wounded surpassed his hatred for the people the wounded man came from. That word compassion in the New Testament is a word that literally talks about like the innermost part of you. Like, it's not just like a fleeting feeling, okay? This is like the dude was broken. Like the dude, like, I mean, I know you felt this before. Like, there's just, you come across a situation or a person who's hurt or something, and there's just something inside of you, like you feel it. There's this compassion, this sympathy, right? Like this heartbreak. And this Samaritan feels it. The priest didn't feel it. The Levite didn't feel it. The Samaritan feels it. And his compassion was more profound than his hatred. And so he stops. And at his own expense, he helps this man who was his enemy. And he saves his life, and he cares for him, and he ensures that the finances are given so that he's cared for even in his absence. And then Jesus says, now don't miss this, here's the meaning of the parable. Jesus says, now who was the neighbor? Who was the friend? And of course, the self-justifying legal expert of the Jewish people is forced to say, there is no other answer other than, well, the one who showed mercy, the one who showed compassion, right? Notice he won't say the Samaritan. He won't say that. But he has to at least acknowledge the one who showed mercy. Well, the one who showed mercy was the Samaritan, and Jesus says, yes, that's exactly right. Now you go and do likewise. And what Jesus is doing, do you see this? Is radically redefining what it means to live in this world and to have neighbors. He's radically redefining what it means to be a Christ follower and engage the world in which you live. Because here's what Jesus is saying, all right? If you're taking notes, just write this down. One thing today. Your neighbor is anyone in need of compassion. Your neighbor is anyone in need of compassion. And when you have the resources and the opportunity to meet the need, you meet the need in Jesus' name. You say, yeah, but they're a Jew or a Samaritan or whatever. Yeah, you know what? Christ followers should be defined by a people of compassion, not a people of hatred. A people who meet the needs of those that we have the opportunity. We can't meet everybody's need, but when we have opportunity and we have the resources, Jesus says, you engage the world. You love them. The two most important things, you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? Well, your neighbor is anyone in need of compassion. And so here's how Jesus flips the story upon this legal expert. The question initially was, who is my neighbor? Jesus isn't interested in those little games. Jesus then asked at the end, who proved to be a neighbor? Who proved to be a neighbor? And if you're new to the Bible, here's what I want you to understand. Jesus is ultimately telling the story about what he will do for you and me. Because you want to know who the ultimate Good Samaritan is? It's Jesus. You know what Jesus did? Jesus had compassion on his enemies. Jesus brought healing at his own expense. Jesus proved to be a neighbor to you and me, to those in need, by coming to this earth, born of a virgin. Yes, it is Christmas season, apparently. It's a little too early for me. I'll be taking that up with Lewis when I get to the lobby. But yeah, you know what? Jesus, the Son of God, the creator of heaven and earth, came to dwell among a people who hated him. And yet he gave his life for them. He shed his blood for them. And then he rose from the dead. In human history, we're not talking about myth or fable. We're talking about a resurrection witnessed by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. We're talking about this Jesus who today, therefore, has offered salvation through his death and through his resurrection, the one who took the wrath of God in our place for our sin. We're talking about this Jesus who then gives freely to those who look to him in faith, who ask for his forgiveness, this Jesus who provides, this Jesus who guides, this Jesus who comforts, the Jesus who does all of this at his own initiative, in his own expense. He does all of it to a people that don't deserve it, a people who have rejected him, and a people, therefore, who love him and serve him because we are the recipients of the greatest gift in the history of the world. He is the Good Samaritan. Jesus is telling this story. You want to know who your neighbor is? Your neighbor is anyone in need. It may be your friend. It may be your enemy. It may be someone you like. It may be someone you dislike. It may be someone you understand. It may be someone you don't understand. But Jesus is ultimately talking about his own ministry and that this is what it looks like to engage your world as your neighbors. It's going to do what I'm going to do, which is when you have the opportunity and the resources to help, you help in my name, for my glory, because what I came to do is to offer salvation to a world that desperately needs it. There's a heaven and a hell. There's eternal joy and there's eternal punishment. Jesus is like, hey, listen, you got to set aside your hatred. You got to set aside your preferences. You got to set aside what you were taught as a youth. And recognize in this world, when you walk by someone who's beaten and bloody and left for dead, and you have the means and the resources to help them, you help them. You get them to me. And if you're new to Bell Shoals and you walk through the lobby today and you're seeing signs with all these countries, all these places we're going, all over the world, you think about the sacrifice of dollars that takes, scheduling a week of vacation. You think about what we do right here at home with our Real Hope house and what happens every single week as we meet the needs of hundreds of families in our communities. You think about all the ministries we are a part of, from preschool to kids to students to adults. When you think about the camps that we do and the events that we offer and all that when you think about all of the collective energy that is Bell Shoals, like, why do these people gather? Why do we give? Why do we go? What? Because Jesus told us. Neighbor doesn't just mean for us a person we like, a person we understand, a person we look like. Actually, we have the means and the opportunity now to engage others all around the world and right here at home, and we're going to do it. Because when you have the means and the opportunity to prove to be a neighbor, you do it. Because there really is no greater joy than coming alongside of Jesus in this Good Samaritan ministry and introducing salvation to those who desperately need it. That's why we do what we do. And I'd love for you to be a part of it. Your neighbors, anybody in need of compassion? Right here at home, around the world. Listen, this emphasis called difference makers that we have every year, it's all about just reminding us, okay, that we live in a world with a lot of broken people. Can I be honest with you? I don't like some of these people. Anybody else with me on that? Hypocrites. Again, you a bunch of hypocrites. Nobody's going to admit. Like, I know there's people you don't like. I've been to parts of the world where I engaged people I wasn't sure I was really going to like. But when I got there and I saw their desperate need, the compassion trumped everything else. I've been to India, and I've seen people worship the cobras that live beneath their human temples. I've seen the murals on the walls of homes of respected leaders. Pictured there on these walls, gods that are purely of human making. And my heart broke. I've been to Central America. I've been to Africa. I've been all over Europe. Let me tell you something. We live in a world where there's a lot of people spiritually dying on the side of the road, and they don't know it. And we have the ultimate Good Samaritan, Jesus, who said, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them what I have taught you. And that's why we do what we do here at Bell Shoals. And no matter how long you've been here or how long you've been a Christ follower, or maybe you're not a Christ follower yet, and Jesus is calling you to himself today, the Good Samaritan. Listen, whatever your story and whatever your situation, I want to encourage you today. You can join us in making a difference by scheduling an ongoing regular gift that, by the way, supports our missionaries and our church planners, by stopping off at a round table today and just getting some information about a country or even a domestic location here. You don't have to travel outside the United States. There are lost people in America. By volunteering at our Hope House. I mean, listen, I just want you to know, you can be a difference maker. You don't have to have a seminary education. You don't have to be, wealthy. You can make a difference. You just need compassion. You just need to not be the priest, the Levite, who's aware of the needs without ever stopping to do anything about it. And before we get out of here today, I just want you to see one more story. It's an episode here of Difference Makers with just a couple people, just like you, just like me, normal folks. And it's so cool just to see how God uses average, ordinary people to make a difference. What's the common ingredient we have other than, the salvation that Jesus gives? It's compassion. All right, let's watch this together.
There are at least two things that fuel a Christ follower when they are on mission: the Holy Spirit and coffee. Colombian coffee is known to be some of the best in the world. You do not have to be a coffee enthusiast to appreciate the robust flavor and rich aroma of native-grown Colombian coffee beans. During our team's time in Colombia, these beans became more than a simple ingredient for a delicious beverage. You might say these beans became seeds for the gospel.
Kevin, a barista at the best coffee shop I've ever been in my life. So we made an effort. We went there every day. You know, by Wednesday, he was like, come on, vámonos. No, that means go. Bien, come in. Okay. Get in here. So we would go in, we'd order something new, we strike up a conversation, ask him how he's doing. And so by Thursday, we're like, okay, Thursday's go time, baby. Like we've been building the relationship. He knows us. He's talked with us. This is why we're here.
That's why you're there.
Not to buy coffee, even though I came home with I came home with 5 pounds of Colombian coffee. But you know, it's also to tell people about Jesus. So we were there. We had our Bible. We had some tracts. We had our translator, and it was just one of those where, for whatever reason, you know, only the Lord knows. I hate to use this word, but we could not close the door. Not that people are projects.
Yeah,
you know what I'm getting at. You know, it's like
that's God's business.
Exactly. He's like, he could not. He just couldn't get there. And so I looked at him and I said, all right, Kevin, here's the deal. I'm going to leave you with the Bible. Okay. Here's what I want you to read. Okay. It's July. All right. I'm coming back in April. I'm going to find the coffee shop. I'm going to come in here and we're going to pick up where we left off, man. You know, because, you know, I care about you and I know Jesus loves you and he's got a plan for you.
Jesus loves you. It is such a simple message. But how do we show the love of Christ to our neighbors? And who exactly are our neighbors? The Word of God tells us that our neighbors are not merely the people who look like us or live where we live. Being a neighbor is seeing people like God sees people and loving them enough to share the truth of the gospel with them. God is using Christ followers like Jocelyn to be a beacon of love every single week at our local food pantry. He used her heart for her neighbors at home in order to help her reach her neighbors all around the world.
One of my favorite passages in the Gospels is when a lawyer comes up to Jesus. He asks Jesus about the way to salvation. And Jesus says, what are the commandments? And he says, love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yes. Right? And Jesus commends him and says, you've done well. And then the lawyer, who I think is getting paid by the hour, right, comes back with a second question. And he says, who is my neighbor? And Jesus launches into an explanation that was not the right question. And he goes into this passage of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan is not asking, who is my neighbor? The Good Samaritan is assuming everyone is his neighbor. And that his responsibility is to show his love for God by serving his neighbor. And when you came to Bell Shoals, I think you said in 2016.
Yes.
You started to serve at the Real Hope House.
When I started working with Real Hope House, it was really amazing to see how people just want to be heard. They want somebody to listen to them, to just show them the love of Christ, period, you know, and just pray for them. People see the church, being God's hands and feet, and that's what he called us to do. Be outside of the building, reaching out to those that are in need.
So you're looking at your community and you're saying that those are my neighbors.
Yes, definitely.
And I'm going to serve them by meeting a physical need.
Yes.
And then I'm going to give them the gospel because that's their greatest need, isn't it? That spiritual need. I'm convinced that as we live our daily lives on mission, it'll drive us to go on mission.
Definitely, because that's the training.
That's right.
That's the training.
Creer en Dios y dejarlo que Él maneje nuestras vidas. Y maybe se están preguntando, ¿cómo yo hago esto? ¿Cómo yo dejo que le recibo este regalo para no tener que estar en el infierno? Pues una manera que podemos hacer eso es, como dije ya, arrepintiéndonos.
I knew on that trip that there was a night that there was supposed to be a family festival. And again, I'm convinced on a mission trip that there's a number of things we plan for, and some of those things happen, but God always has his plan, his agenda. And I know that there was a night in which a group of students thought that they could be better used, not necessarily at the pet festival, but over with another group of kids.
That night, I remember that the kids were trying to play soccer with the older kids, but they wanted us to be right at the festival, which it was across the street. So that's what we were told. No, everybody have to go over there. But the kids came to me and they told me, but these kids are too old. They do not want to go to the festival because they feel like that is like too kiddish for them. Can we just hang out here with them and just play with them and talk to them? And it was incredible because the kids connected with them. They played soccer. They had tons of fun. And towards the end, when the gospel was going to be shared, those kids went with us to the park. And 2 of them gave their heart to Jesus. So it was through that connection that God used that to make a way for them to actually listen to the gospel and receive the word of God and just accept Jesus Christ as the Lord and Savior.
Sometimes showing love to our neighbors is meeting a physical need, and sometimes it's simply being willing to care enough about them to listen to their story. Our lead filmmaker, Tim LaPointe, was in Colombia to capture the life change taking place all around him. However, God had a slightly different plan. The life change that God had in store for Tim was not only happening around him, it was happening within him.
So one of your gifts is that when I look around this room, this is what you do, the lights, the camera. This is your world. So you and Pastor Stephen headed to Bogota in this mission trip in which, you're responsible with bringing the footage home, capturing the action, the gospel being presented, whether it's at the church or whether it's at a festival, interactions between Pastor Stephen and the barista. And then God starts to work in your heart, doing a work that maybe you didn't expect on that trip. Talk to me about that.
Saturday we got into Bogota. We were in our hotel, going to bed, lights out, and I just lay in my bed and found myself praying, something that I didn't really plan to pray. It wasn't something that was necessarily on my mind. It was almost as if God was putting that in my heart, which was, God, would you give me the boldness to share the gospel? And I'm thinking, why am I praying that? Because that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to film these stories, take these stories back. Why am I praying for boldness to share the gospel?
So we're in the government section. You got the House of Representatives there, you got the mayor's house there. We're in smack dab Bogota Central right here. Beautiful place. Got the mountains in the background, 64 degrees. I mean, it's just a great day. We're out and we're walking, and here comes this young kid.
Santiago is a 12-year-old boy who has grown up in Bogota.
Mom is sick. Dad is nowhere in the picture. And he walks, several miles to be in this square every day to sell these bracelets, to get some money, to provide for his family.
I still have one of the bracelets that he gave me, and he's doing that to put food on the table. So a lot of pressure on this 12-year-old kid who really should just be free to be a kid, and instead he's got a lot that he's got to think about to take care of his family. And I said, hey, can I share my story with you?
So Tim weaves in the gospel and just lays it out there, the good news of what Jesus has done for him on the cross, and says, is that something that you would like? Would you like to do that today? And right there he responded, he said, yeah, I would.
So I prayed with him to receive Christ, but now I know that he has a totally different future, even in the hardships, because I've seen that in my own life. The hard things that God has brought me through, it doesn't mean that the hard things aren't hard, but it does mean that I have a God who's with me through all of those. And it does mean that my eternal future is 100% secure.
How has that changed you today? How has being on that particular mission trip impacted where you're at today?
I think for a lot of people, they might practice being on mission here at home and then feel confident to go on a mission trip. For me, it was actually the opposite. It was going on a mission trip, having that experience. Now I'm coming home and realizing, man, I see lostness differently now. I see the world around me differently now. I see the broken people around me differently, but I also see them differently because I've seen how effective the gospel can be in bringing hope to that brokenness. So because I've had a conversation with someone like Santiago, I've seen what that hope can do. I know that that same hope is available for my neighbors. And now I've seen just how much a simple prayer of God, would you give me the boldness to share the gospel, can equip me to be able to do that. I want to be a part of that.
Our neighbors are in coffee shops, soccer fields, and city squares. Our neighbors are in our community, and they're thousands of miles away. Sometimes our neighbors need a helping hand. At other times, they simply need to be seen and heard. But all of them need the hope that is found in Jesus Christ. God can change the way we see lostness, change the way we see brokenness, change the way we see our neighbors, because God's love changes absolutely everything.
All right, so we're going to continue to prove to be a neighbor to those in need. That has always been the heartbeat of Bell Shoals. That's going to continue to be the heartbeat of Bell Shoals. I believe the Lord has so richly blessed our faith family because from day one, it's been our commitment to get the gospel to the nations. We don't do what we do for us. We do it for the Lord, for his glory, in obedience to his commands, that we might be a blessing to those around us. And so I want to invite you to be a part of what God's doing here at Bell Shoals. As you work through the lobby today, hey, stop by one of the round tables. Just get some information. I'll be out there in the lobby here in a moment. I'd love to meet you, talk with you, pray with you, and just help you be a part of all that God is doing. And just like what I learned the first time I went to South Africa, God can use a basketball to bring people to Jesus. He can use a skill you have. Maybe it's athletics, maybe it's construction, maybe it's evangelism, maybe it's helping out with a church planter. I mean, maybe it's just going along and serving, being a helping hand. I'm just telling you, it's amazing to see how the Lord uses what we consider to be so ordinary and routine in extraordinary ways when we just commit to leverage our time, talent, treasure for him. So I want to encourage you to be a part of that, all right?